A gondolier vanishes into the Venetian mist, but his whispers linger in the shadows. Welcome to Rust Evidence. I am your host, Silas Wren. This growing mystery-loving family is amazing. Comment below and share where you're listening from. Reading your stories makes every case even better. Let's begin. This was just past 4 in the afternoon when Maigret pushed the window open to let in the grey, persistent drizzle. It made the curtains flap a little, and Madame Maigret looked up from her knitting without pausing. The stove hissed. Outside, the boulevard Richard Lenoir looked almost deserted, umbrellas bobbing like dark mushrooms among the parked Citroëns and delivery carts. He lit a cigarette, then realized he didn't really want it. He stood with it burning between his fingers, smoke curling out into the cold dampness, mingling with the scent of boiled potatoes and soap. Somewhere in the building, a radio murmured a chant from last year. "It's going to be one of those springs," he murmured. Madame Maigret, whose needles had paused now, replied. "The concierge says it hasn't dried a single bedsheet in 3 days." He grunted, not at the remark but at the mood it gave him. A sort of slow heaviness, like the city had decided to exhale a sigh and forget to breathe back in. He didn't expect a call. The office would be quiet. Torrance was handling a burglary in Montparnasse, and Lognon had, as usual, wrapped himself into a knot over a petty fraud in the 14th. It was his day off. He could have stayed home. But even as he thought that, his coat was already in his hands, and Madame Maigret, with no comment, was rising to fetch his hat from the peg near the door. He kissed her cheek. Her skin smelled faintly of starch and hand cream. "Don't forget we have veal for supper," she said, as if it was important. Maybe it was. Through the drizzle, past shuttered flower kiosks and over puddled cobblestones, his collar turned up, not against the cold, it wasn't really cold, but against the mood. Paris, on days like this, became something subterranean, a city of lowered gazes and hunched shoulders, where even the dogs were quiet. He turned into Rue de Touraine, almost without thought, passing cafes where lonely men stared into their glasses. Outside a tobacconist's, an old man watched the rain with the suspicion of someone who had once been betrayed by weather. That was when he noticed the figure, not someone he knew, not someone suspicious, not yet, just a man in a black coat, sitting on a bench under a tree that had not yet decided to bloom. The man was still, oddly so, his hands folded, his back too straight. He might have been sleeping, but his eyes were open. Maigret passed him by, slowly, just enough to glimpse a detail too dry. The man's shoes were too dry for someone who had sat out in this weather long. He paused, lit another cigarette, and walked back. The man was thin, perhaps 50, his hat on the bench beside him. His suit was not expensive, but carefully brushed. There was something vaguely theatrical in the curve of his mustache, the stiffness of his collar, as if he were playing the part of someone rather than simply being him. "Are you waiting for someone?" Maigret asked, gently. The man turned his head, slowly, with a polite sort of surprise. "No, monsieur, you're not from this quartier." "No." A pause. The man smiled faintly, not warmly. "I am passing through. I'm staying at the Hotel Mistral, near the canal." Maigret gave a small nod. He said nothing more, but the silence stretched like a thread being pulled. The man seemed to realize he was being studied. He straightened his coat. "I was just thinking," he said, almost to himself, "how still Paris can be, even with the rain." Maigret made a sound in his throat, neither agreement nor disagreement. He dropped the cigarette and crushed it beneath his heel. A moment passed. Somewhere behind them, a bell rang. A tram went by. "I once knew a gondolier who never stopped whispering," the man added absently. Maigret looked at him now, more carefully. "In Venice." A nod. "And what did he whisper?" The man smiled again, thinner this time. "That is a long story." Then he stood, picked up his hat, and walked off with the slow grace of someone who had never been truly in a hurry. Maigret stood for a while longer by the bench, frowning slightly. A gondolier, who whispered, a man too dry in the rain. It was probably nothing. It often was, but he had learned that the scent of a story didn't always come from the obvious places. It floated up like smoke, from the smallest gestures, from a pause too long, or a word too carefully chosen. The Hotel Mistral, near the canal. Perhaps he'd pass by, just to see. It sat on a narrow stretch of the Rue de Récollet, near the Canal Saint-Martin, hemmed in between a shuttered pharmacy and a tailor's shop that displayed moth-bitten waistcoats and lapels gone yellow with time. Its sign was cracked enamel, the letters Hotel Mistral faint beneath a patina of soot and damp. Maigret arrived just after 6. The rain had slowed to a fine mist, and the canal was smooth and greenish, broken only by the occasional ripple from a pigeon taking flight. A boy leaned over the edge, dropping breadcrumbs to something invisible below. Across the canal a butcher swept his steps with indifference, his apron stained and flapping. The lobby of the Hotel Mistral was quiet. It smelled faintly of linoleum, cabbage, and old wallpaper paste. A small counter stood beneath a yellowed print of the Alps, and behind it, a woman of indeterminate age sat in a sagging armchair, peeling a hard-boiled egg with deliberate care. She glanced up without interest. "Bonsoir," Maigret said, pulling off his coat was beaded with water, and he didn't shake it off. She nodded and took a slow bite of her egg. "You need a room?" Maigret smiled faintly. "No, I'm looking for a guest. A man, about 50, slim, small mustache, dark coat. He said he's staying here." She chewed, narrowed her eyes and swallowed. "We don't have many like that. But you have one?" She made a vague gesture toward the stairs. "3rd floor, room 12. Name's Fabre. Arrived 3 days ago. Says he's from Lyon. Never talks much. Has he had visitors?" She sniffed. "Not that I've seen. Quiet man. Comes in late, goes out early. Walks like he's afraid of making a sound." Maigret nodded, thanked her, and slowly made his way up the narrow staircase. The carpet was threadbare, the banister loose in its bracket. A single dim bulb flickered on the landing. He didn't knock. He paused just outside room 12, listening. From within came only silence, not the silence of an empty room, but something heavier. The air felt still, then a faint creak like someone shifting on a bed. He knocked once, firmly. No answer. Then again softer. "Who is it?" came the voice. Not startled, not defensive, just flat. "Chief Inspector Maigret," he said. "May I come in?" A pause, then the sound of a latch turning. The door opened just enough for Maigret to see Fabre's face. He looked the same as before, tidy, reserved, with a faint, unreadable smile. He wore a white shirt now, the collar loosened, and there was a small cut on his cheek already scabbed. Fabre stepped aside without a word, allowing Maigret to enter. The room was plain, a single bed, a narrow desk, a suitcase lying open with neat rows of shirts and ties folded military style. On the desk, a bottle of mineral water, an ashtray with a single stubbed-out cigarette, and a book, La Chartreuse de Parme, spine cracked halfway through. "You remembered," Fabre said, as Maigret sat without invitation on the room's only chair. "Oh, I remember small things," Maigret replied, "especially when they don't quite fit." Fabre gave a faint laugh, not mocking, more thoughtful. He moved to the window and looked out, though there was little to see but the wet rooftops and the flicker of neon from a nearby bar. "You're not here about anything in particular," he said after a moment. "No. Then why?" Maigret lit his pipe, puffed once twice. "You're too dry for a man sitting in the rain." Fabre turned, surprised, but only faintly. "I had an umbrella. You didn't have it with you." Silence again. Maigret let it stretch. "Are you from Lyon?" he asked finally. Fabre gave a small shake of the head. "No." "Then why say you are?" Another pause. Fabre walked over to the bed and sat on the edge, hands resting on his knees. It seemed simpler. Maigret nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "And the gondolier?" Fabre gave a slow smile. "Ah, that." He said nothing more. The silence between them became companionable in its tension. "Do you know someone named Delphos?" Maigret asked, almost eagerly. Fabre's eyes twitched, just once. Not alarm, not recognition, but the reflexive flicker of memory. Then he blinked it away. "No, I didn't say he was from here." "No," Fabre said quietly. "You didn't." Maigret stood, stretched slightly. "Will you be here tomorrow?" "I don't plan on going anywhere." Maigret nodded again. "Good." At the door he paused. "One last question. Why did you really come to Paris?" Fabre looked up, his face unreadable. "To disappear." Maigret didn't ask from what. He simply stepped out into the dim corridor, his footsteps muffled on the worn carpet. He walked back toward the canal, passing shuttered windows and doorways that smelled of old yeast and damp cloth. His pipe had gone out. At the corner of Rue Bichat, he saw Lognon, standing under a dripping awning, collar up, cigarette in hand, looking like he'd been scolded by fate itself. "Maigret," Lognon muttered, not quite surprised to see him. "You're working on your day off, taking a walk, in this neighborhood?" Maigret gave a small shrug. "Someone I met in the rain said something odd, so I followed the rain." Lognon snorted. "You and your They stood there for a moment. Then Lognon muttered, "There was a report. Man found floating in the canal near the locks this morning. No ID, no wallet, small cut on his cheek." Maigret's head tilted slightly. "Was he dry?" "Dry? Never mind." Maigret. He turned and looked back toward the direction of the Hotel Mistral. Lognon frowned. "You think it's connected?" Maigret didn't answer. He took out his pipe again, relit it, and let the smoke drift into the night like a thought not quite ready to be spoken. The next morning was clearer, but only just. A pale wash of sunlight filtered through the grimy windows of the Quai des Orfèvres, giving the tiled corridor a sickly sheen. Maigret stood by the stove in his office, cradling a chipped white cup of coffee in both hands, letting the warmth soak into his fingers. The coffee was already lukewarm. He didn't mind. He'd been awake since 5. Madame Maigret had said nothing when he rose early. She had simply looked at him from her pillow, her eyes soft but unreadable. She knew better than to ask. There were mornings like this, not many, but enough over the years for a rhythm to have set in between them. He had left with the scent of black soap and silence following him out the door. Torrance had already arrived, and was thumbing through reports with that neat mechanical efficiency of his. He glanced up as Maigret entered, but said nothing. At Maigret's nod, he rose and placed a single folder on the inspector's desk. About the body in the canal. Maigret sat heavily, and opened it. The man had no papers, no wallet, no keys. Nothing but a packet of Gauloise soaked beyond recognition, and a torn scrap of a receipt for a tailor's shop near the Gare de l'Est. The Sorel, retouch and confection. The cause of death was likely drowning, but there was a shallow cut on his right cheekbone, a match perhaps for the one on Fabre's face, though it could easily be coincidence. He flipped the file shut and looked at Torrance. "Anything else?" "We spoke with the lock-keeper near the scene. Said the body hadn't been there long, maybe 2 or 3 hours before it was spotted. No one saw it being dumped. No suspicious vehicles. It's an awkward place, you know. If someone meant to be seen, they chose the wrong stretch of water." Maigret grunted. "And the tailor?" "Closed yesterday, back open this morning." Maigret stood again, reached for his coat, and tucked his scarf inside it with the slow precision of a man tying together stray thoughts. "I'll go myself." The tailor's shop was a narrow slip between a bakery and a tobacconist, barely wider than its own doorway. Inside, the air smelled of dust, chalk and ironed wool. A bell tinkled as Maigret entered, and an elderly man with pince-nez and the stooped posture of a man married to his needle appeared from behind a green curtain. "Bonjour," Maigret said. "I'm looking for someone who came in recently. Might have had a receipt from here. The name Fabre ring a bell." The man squinted at him. "Could be. I don't ask names unless I have to. People leave things, I mend them. If they pay, I remember. If not, I forget. Someone left something recently. A coat of expensive cloth, poor fit. Looked borrowed. Said he'd be back for it today. Describe him. Slender, quiet. Didn't like to meet the eye. Face like someone always thinking of something unpleasant but too polite to say." Maigret gave a small nod. "Did he say where he got the coat?" "He did not." "May I see it?" The tailor disappeared again and returned moments later with a neatly folded dark overcoat. It was finely made, Italian probably, and though the fabric was of good quality, the sleeves were clearly too long for whoever had worn it. Maigret ran his fingers inside the lining and found a name, hand-stitched into the silk, A. Lemoine. He raised an eyebrow. "Do you keep a record of clients?" The tailor looked offended. "I'm not a bank. People come and go." Maigret didn't He left the shop with the coat over his arm, and lit his pipe as he stepped into the street. A. Lemoine. That name stirred something not from a case, but a passing file. A background report read half attentively one afternoon years ago. He walked slowly back toward the quay, stopping to stare into shop windows without really seeing them. The city bustled around him, delivery boys shouting, a woman chastising her dog, someone whistling off-key from a third-story window. But Maigret moved through it as if underwater, his thoughts slow and suspended. Back at his office he thumbed through the central registry. It didn't take long. Lemoine, a line. Born 1892, registered last address Rue de Tournelle, no criminal record. Small-time performer, singer, later a boatman in Venice, disappeared from records in night, presumed dead, no body ever found. The whispering gondolier. Maigret sat back. The phrase came back to him now, fully formed. Fabre's casual remark on the bench. I once knew a gondolier who never stopped whispering. It hadn't been idle nostalgia, it had been reference, perhaps confession, or deflection. So was Fabre really Lemoine, or had he borrowed his coat, his story, his life? The door creaked open, and Lognon stepped in, his coat still wet despite the clearer skies. I thought I'd find you here, he said, and dropped a small envelope on the desk. One of the morgue boys recognized the body from the canal. A street violinist, Jean-Marie Lepic, played outside cafes in the Marais. No fixed address, bit of a drinker. Any connection to Fabre? None we can find, but the time fits. He died sometime after 3 in the morning. Maigret glanced at the overcoat again. Can we trace Lemoine's old contacts? Lognon gave a tired shrug. What's left of them? Most have scattered. That whole Venice crowd, performers, expats, drifters, wartime blew it all apart. Maigret rose. I'm going to visit Fabre again. This time Fabre opened the door without hesitation. I thought you might return, he said. I have a coat, Maigret said, holding it up. Recognize it. Fabre took it slowly, turned it over in his hands, then folded it and set it on the bed. It belonged to someone I once knew. Lemoine. Fabre nodded. Where is he now? A pause, then gone. Years ago. Did you kill him? No, Fabre said, and the quietness of it made Maigret believe him, at least for now. What about the man in the canal? Fabre looked up, startled, truly startled this time. What man? Maigret watched him for a long moment. He had a cut on his face, he said. Fabre instinctively touched his own cheek. So do I. Maigret stepped closer, his presence filling the small room. You said you came here to disappear. Why? Fabre didn't answer, but something in his expression, the way his lips tightened, the faint shimmer in his eyes, told Maigret that the answer wasn't far. He sat down in the chair again, just like before, and said nothing. Let the silence thicken. Eventually Fabre spoke, voice low, as if to the coat itself. Sometimes a man sees too much, or hears too much, even if no one believes him, and sometimes, Maigret replied, they whisper too much. The two men sat there for a long while, the sound of the street below filtering through the window like another kind of silence, alive, but distant. The afternoon wore on gently, a reluctant sun pulling through the Paris haze in thin streaks of light that lit the Seine like dull silver. Maigret walked along the embankment near Pont de Soleil, his hands deep in his coat pockets, the collar turned up as always. The coat still held the faint scent of Fabre's room, boiled linens, old tobacco, and something faintly medicinal, like camphor. He had left the Hotel Mistral without pressing further. There was no use in pushing Fabre. A man like that, neat, reserved, tightly wound in his own rituals, would only speak when the silence got too loud for him to bear. The real work, Maigret knew, wasn't to corner him with questions, but to listen to the cracks in what he didn't say. Still, something was forming in his mind, not yet solid, the weight of a long-ago tragedy perhaps, or an unresolved grievance that had floated too long beneath the surface. And Venice, the mention of it, felt central, like the thread of an old coat, that would unravel everything if pulled just right. At the Quai des Orfèvres, he returned to his office with a soft grunt and sat at his desk. His pipe had gone cold again. He didn't bother relighting. Torrance looked in. We found a cousin of that street violinist, he said, the one from the canal. Maigret glanced up. Name's Émile Lepic. Lives in a boarding house off Rue Saint-Martin. Runs a small printing shop. Maigret rose. Let's go. The shop was cramped and smelled of ink and damp paper. Flyers for jazz concerts and discount tailoring were pinned to a corkboard near the entrance, their corners curled from age and humidity. A small press clanked steadily in the back. attended by a wiry man in rolled-up sleeves, his fingers blackened. He looked up as they entered, his expression wary. "You Emile Lepic?" "Yes, Maigret. This is Inspector Torrance." The man wiped his hands on a rag. "You're here about Jean-Marie?" "Yes." Emile nodded, as if he'd been expecting it. "They told me he was found in the canal." He used to sleep rough, but he wasn't the sort to jump in himself. "We're not certain what happened," Maigret said, "but we're trying to understand who might have wanted to harm him." Emile gave a dry, humorless laugh. Jean-Marie wasn't the kind of man people hate, but he had a mouth on him. Played his fiddle outside cafes, yes, but he also liked to talk, especially when he drank. He saw things, or said he did, claimed he knew people from before the war. "Big names," he said. "I always thought he was exaggerating." "Did he ever mention Venice?" Maigret asked. The question caught Emile off guard. "Venice? Yes." A pause. Then Emile scratched the back of his neck. "Come to think of it, yes, once or twice. Said he used to busk there too during the lean years. After 39, I think. Said he met a singer, a Frenchman who sang in some cheap bar along the Grand Canal. Said he always wore black and whispered to himself between songs." Maigret and Torrance exchanged a glance. "Did he say this singer's name?" "No, just the Gondolier. Thought it was a joke." "Did Jean-Marie ever mention seeing him again?" Emile shook his head. "He might. He talked nonsense sometimes. A week ago he came in here late, drunk and cold. Said he'd seen a ghost. That's what he called him. The Gondolier's back, he said, but he's not singing anymore. I thought he was rambling. Maybe he was." Maigret thanked him and stepped out, the door closing with a soft bell chime behind them. That night, Maigret sat in his usual spot at the Brasserie Dauphine, alone with a beer that had gone warm and a small notebook he wasn't writing. Outside, the city had gone back to its wet, restless rhythm, people hurrying nowhere in particular, eyes lowered, shoulders hunched. He didn't need to return to Fabre yet, not until something shifted. Instead he walked back along the Rue des Récollets, letting the sound of the rain and the splash of car tires settle his thoughts. Near the canal he paused. The spot where the body had been pulled from the water looked no different now, but something about it tugged at him. There was a narrow access stair, rusted and green with moss, leading to the waterline. A discarded wine bottle floated there, bobbing lazily. He stared at it for a long time. Then he lit a cigarette and turned back toward the Mistral. Fabre wasn't in. The concierge frowned at the sound of Maigret's name. "He left before dinner," she said. "Didn't say where he was going. He never does." "Did he take anything?" "Not that I saw." Maigret hesitated. "Did you know if he received any letters while staying here?" She gave a grunt. "We don't get much mail, but yes, 1-2 days ago." "From where?" She shrugged. "Didn't look." "Small envelope. Pale blue." "Do you still have the envelope?" She shook her head. He read it in the lobby, tore it in half and dropped it in the wastebasket. "May I see that?" She led him to a narrow cabinet behind the counter. The wastebasket was mostly filled with old receipts and orange peel, but halfway down, Maigret found what he was looking for, 2 torn halves of a pale blue envelope. He fished them out carefully and pieced them together on the counter. The handwriting was elegant, with an old-fashioned slant. The return address was from Venice. No, just Sestia Canaregio Pensione Giulia. Maigret stared at the envelope. The scent of river water and rotting pilings seemed to rise from it. Something from long ago had returned, not just to Fabre, but perhaps to claim what had once been left behind in that fog-bound city of masks and secrets. Back at the quay, Maigret placed the envelope in an evidence sleeve and sat down heavily. He looked at the name Pensione Giulia. Again, it meant nothing directly, but the presence of the letter, and Fabre's reaction to it, meant everything. Torrance knocked quietly and entered. "We found something else," he said, in the victim's coat pocket. The lining had a T. Inside was a matchbook. It was damp but legible. He handed it over. Maigret turned it in his hands. It read, "Bar Casanova, Venezia," and inside a single scrawled word in different handwriting. Veronique handwriting. Veronique hand. He stared at it for a long time, then stood slowly, the chair creaking behind him. The gondolier had whispered something long ago, and now, finally, it had drifted back to the surface. It was a quiet hour, not late, not early, when Maigret found himself again on the Rue des Récollets, standing opposite the Hotel Mistral. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick, its puddles reflecting the weak glow of gaslights. A cat picked its way across the road, indifferent to the human stories unfolding behind shutters. Fabre had not returned. Maigret didn't press the concierge for more. She gave him a glance that said she disapproved of men who asked too many questions about others who minded their own business. He understood. It was the sort of place where secrets stayed on the third floor, and rarely walked down to the lobby. He took a seat in the cafe 2 doors down, ordered a Calvados, lit his pipe, and waited. It wasn't an official vigil. There was no warrant, no patrol assigned, just something in Fabre's silence, in the name Veronique, written in another hand, in the faint tremble Maigret had glimpsed. When Fabre touched the scar on his cheek, something was pulling the man back through time, through memory, and now, it seemed, through just before 11, Fabre returned. He moved like a shadow, no umbrella, no coat, his shoulders hunched, his pace slow as if reluctant to arrive. Maigret paid for his drink and stepped outside without hurrying. He entered the hotel just as the concierge was handing Fabre his key. She saw Maigret and said nothing, though her gaze lingered. Fabre turned, surprised. "You're persistent," he said. "You're interesting." Maigret replied. They climbed the stairs together, no words between them. Inside room 12 the air was stale, a faint smell of lavender from the drawer where Fabre kept his handkerchiefs. A kettle, long cold, stood beside a cup with dried tea leaves clinging to the rim. "You had a letter," Maigret said once they sat. "From Venice." Fabre didn't deny it. He looked toward the window, where the curtain stirred faintly with the night breeze. "It was nothing. It never is." A long silence. Then Fabre, still not looking at Maigret, began to speak. Her name was Veronique Delmas, half French, half Venetian. Her mother ran a guest house, the Pension Julia, near the Cannaregio Canal, not far from the Jewish ghetto. It was quiet. Tourists didn't go there. This was before the war, before the Germans really pushed south. I was singing in a place called the Bar Casanova. Cheap brandy, worse pianos. But people came. The war made everyone hungry for distraction. She came every Thursday, always alone, never spoke unless spoken to, sat in the back and drank Amaro, always just one. The sort of woman men noticed, but didn't approach, not out of fear, but out of instinct, like she carried an invisible border around her. Fabre paused and Maigret didn't speak. The room had become another kind of space, drawn out not by walls but by memory. One night, she stayed after the others left. Said I had a voice like someone trying not to be overheard. I told her it was the acoustics. She laughed. I hadn't realized until then that I'd been waiting for that sound. She invited me to walk her home. We passed gondolas tied to their moorings, the moon making ribbons on the water. She said strange things, that the city was made of secrets, that every echo was someone else's confession. I should have listened more closely. Another silence. She was involved with a man, old, French, I think, though he used a different name each time he registered at the pension. He had money, influence. You could smell both on his coat. But there was something else, a danger. He wasn't a criminal, not officially, but the kind of man who arranges things that never make it into reports. He was in Venice, doing, I don't know, not espionage, procurement, black market deals. During the war such men moved freely, like rats between ships. Maigret's voice was low. What happened? Fabre turned his gaze toward him now. There was something raw in it, not pain exactly, but the weariness of someone who's carried a secret too long. He hurt her. I don't know how deeply, or for how long, she never said, but I saw it in the way she sat quieter each week, the bruises that didn't look like accidents, the way she began to talk of escape. She wanted to come to France, said she had family here, that the man Lemoine, I later learned, wouldn't let her go, said she belonged to him. Then one night, she didn't come to the bar, and the next morning, the police came to the pension. She was gone, just gone, her things still there, her bed made, no note. The man had left too. Maigret sat back, pipe forgotten in his hand. You never found her? No. And the man? Fabre's mouth twisted. I looked for him, for months, until the war ended. Then I came to Paris. I found a tailor, recognized the coat Lemoyne used to wear, bought it, kept it. I don't know why, maybe as proof he existed. Maigret was silent. Outside, the city seemed to exhale. And now, Fabre said, a man from that time is dead in the canal. You knew him? Fabre shook his head. I recognized him. He was there, in Venice. Not close to Veronique, but part of the same circle. He used to play violin on the streets near the Rialto. I think he saw what happened. Maybe too much, maybe he remembered me. And now, I saw him 2 nights ago, near the canal. He saw me, he called me the ghost, said he knew. I didn't believe him. I thought he was drunk. He closed his eyes. If he's dead, I didn't kill him. Maigret believed him, not because of what he said, but because of how he said it. There was a dull sorrow in his tone, not guilt. What was in the letter from Venice? Fabre hesitated. It was just one sentence. She is not forgotten. Maigret stood. I'll find out who sent it. Fabre looked up, surprised. You believe me. I believe that silence doesn't lie. It just waits. Sestia Cannaregio, Pensione Giulia. It was still there, after all these years, still holding its ghosts. And someone there remembered. The name Veronique was no longer just a scribble on a matchbook. She had been real, and perhaps, in some way still was. He lit his pipe. In the morning, he would speak to the consulate. If the truth lay in Venice, he would follow the whisper there. Air travel was for officials and salesmen. A train offered time, and time was where the truth often showed its face. He sat in a compartment by himself, coat folded beside him, hat resting on the seat opposite. The rhythm of the train, its low, steady hum across the eastern French countryside, suited his thoughts. Somewhere between Dijon and Milan, a light drizzle began, trailing streaks across the windows like a memory trying to find its shape. He stared at them a long while, the way he used to stare at suspects who hadn't yet decided whether to lie. He wasn't chasing a crime, not exactly. He was following a feeling, a thread that had started in a stranger's smile on a Paris bench, and had wound its way through a drowned violinist, a torn envelope, and a voice that once sang in bars beside shadowed canals. By the time the train pulled into Santa Lucia station, dusk had fallen. Venice welcomed him the way only Venice could, with stillness, not silence, but stillness, a world afloat on water and secrets, where voices echoed off stone and every corner carried the smell of brine, decay and perfume. The station opened into a world unchanged and yet always vanishing. A water taxi brought him across the Grand Canal. He didn't speak. The gondolier didn't ask, just guided the vessel like a man who'd long since stopped noticing the city around him. He arrived at the Pensione Giulia just after 8. It stood tucked into a small campo in Cannaregio, partly hidden behind a crumbling stone wall overgrown with ivy. The brass plate beside the door was dulled by time. Pensione Giulia, Casa per Signora. An iron bell hung on a loop. Maigret rang it once. After a few minutes, a woman in her 60s opened the door. She was tall with grey hair pinned back in a careful bun, and wore a dark cardigan over a blouse that had once been white. Her eyes were clear, sharp and not entirely welcoming. Buonasera, she said. Bonsoir. Chief Inspector, Maigret, Police Judiciaire, Paris. He offered his identification with quiet formality. Her eyes flicked down, then up. You've come a long way, Inspector. I follow the rain, he replied. That earned the faintest smile. She stepped aside. I'm Elisabetta Delmas. This was my mother's house. I manage it now. They walked into a narrow hall that smelled of lavender and old stone. Photographs hung on the walls, black and white scenes of gondolas, opera houses, young women in high collars. Elisabetta gestured toward a small sitting room where a lamp glowed beside a worn divan. A glass of grappa stood untouched on a table. She didn't offer Maigret one. You're here about Veronique. It wasn't a question. Yes, Maigret nodded, but not forgotten. Someone wrote to a man in Paris, just a sentence. She is not forgotten. It was enough to bring old things to the surface. She looked away. My sister was, how do you say it, touched by certain men, too young, too romantic, too beautiful. They called her La Chanteuse Mutette, the mute singer, because she never sang. only listened. She had a connection with a man named Fabre. Her mouth twitched slightly. Fabre. No, that wasn't his name then. He was called André. A baritone. Too serious. They would walk the alleys late, talk about things that didn't belong to this world. He wanted to save her, but you can't save someone who doesn't believe in rescue. Maigret leaned forward slightly. She disappeared. No investigation. During the war, Elisabetta's smile was bitter. People disappeared every day. Sometimes they came back with different names. Sometimes not at all. Do you believe she died? I believe she left something behind. I don't know if it was her life. Maigret took a paper from his coat, a copy of the matchbook found on the body in the canal. He laid it on the table. Do you recognize this handwriting? Elisabetta stared at it. Her face didn't change, but her fingers, resting on the arm of the chair, curled slightly. Yeah, that's mine. Maigret's brow rose. You sent the letter. I did. Why? She stood and walked to the window, looking out onto the quiet canal. Because a man came through the campo last week. Older, pale. He walked like someone who knew where he was going, but hadn't been there in years. He stood across the street from the house, didn't knock, just stared for a long time. Then he left. You recognized him? Yes. André. Fabre. Whatever he calls himself now. She turned, folding her arms. I saw what it did to him. Time, guilt, and perhaps he believed he was the only one left who remembered her. I wanted him to know he wasn't. Maigret nodded slowly. You knew about Lemoyne? She hesitated. The man Veronique was involved with. Yeah, he used aliases. Italian, French. He paid in American dollars, then disappeared when the Carabinieri got too close. There were rumors afterward that he'd surfaced in Marseille or Argentina, but no one ever proved it. What do you believe? I believe men like that never disappear. They just become quieter, richer, and more careful. Maigret didn't reply. The room was still heavy with time. Did you know a man named Jean-Marie Lepake? He asked. No, but I remember the violinists. They played outside the fish market. One of them once said something odd to me. Years ago, he said he'd seen a ghost leave the pension one night and vanish into the canal. A ghost? That's what he called her. Veronique. The moon hung low, casting long, watery reflections along the canals. Venice, in its silence, spoke more than words could. He stopped near a narrow footbridge and leaned on the railing. Somewhere distantly, a gondolier sang, not for tourists but to himself. The notes were broken, almost whispered. A shadow passed on the water. He thought of Fabre, of the weight he carried, of the life Veronique might have led if not taken, then dissolved slowly by fear and memory. He thought of Elisabetta, who had sent a letter not to accuse but to remind, and of a drowned violinist, who had called a man ghost and died with a matchbook in his coat. Maigret didn't yet have the whole truth, but he felt its outline, and soon Fabre would have to face it. A steady clatter and the stiff-backed seats conspired against sleep, but Maigret didn't seem to mind. He had risen early, before the city stirred, and walked one last time, along the misty fondamenta behind the Pension à Julia, as if something might linger in the stones. A step, a sigh, a whisper, but Venice was expert at keeping its dead close and its truths distant. Back in Paris, the air felt heavier, more immediate. The Seine wasn't the Grand Canal, but it carried secrets just the same, only more impatient ones. Maigret arrived at the Quai des Orfèvres just after midday, and was met by the smell of stale coffee and a desk piled with reports. Torrance greeted him at the door. Lognon's been pacing like a priest outside confession, he said dryly. Let him pace. Torrance handed him a file, lighter than it looked. About the coat, he said. The tailor was right. It belonged to Alain Lemoyne, confirmed by his cousin, a retired notary in Lyon. Lemoyne disappeared in 47, left everything behind. No will, no death certificate, just gone. And the cousin swears he saw him again in 61. Briefly, said he looked thinner, more worn, called himself something else. They passed in a train station, said nothing. He didn't follow. Maigret grunted. And the violinist. Torrance hesitated. A witness has come forward. A night porter from a hotel near the canal says he saw the victim speaking with someone around 2 a.m. Night of the drowning. Said the man had a deep voice, spoke little, wore a black coat, gave no name. Anything else? The young inspector hesitated.
Said he thought he saw the same man in the neighborhood 3 nights earlier, watching from across the street. Maigret sat down heavily. And Fabre, no sign since your visit. Hotel says he hasn't returned. His things are still in the room. Maigret walked to the Hotel Mistral alone. The concierge was sitting by the window with a crossword puzzle and a cup of chicory. She barely looked up when he entered. He hasn't come back, she said. I know. Should I be worried? Maigret shook his head. He's not dangerous. She smirked. That's what the dangerous ones always look like. He climbed the stairs and entered room 12, using a key she handed over with little protest. The air was undisturbed, stale with absence. Everything remained where it had been. The suitcase still open on the chair. The coat with the name Lemoine folded at the foot of the bed. A pair of cufflinks glinted from the nightstand. Maigret sat, lit his pipe and waited. Sometimes the only way to catch the end of a story was to stay still and let it come back. Just to sit across the street. There's something about the sound of rehearsals, that distant hum through stone. It reminds me of. He didn't finish, sat down on the edge of the bed instead. You went to Venice, he added after a moment. Yes. And did she speak to you? She's gone. But her sister remembers. She sent the letter. Fabre nodded slowly. I thought it might be her. She used to write poetry on napkins, never signed them. You've been carrying this a long time. Fabre ran a hand over his face, long enough that it started to feel like mine. Maigret let the silence stretch, then spoke gently. The violinist, Jean-Marie, recognized you. Yes, he called you a ghost. Fabre smiled faintly. Fitting. No. What did he want? Money, I think, or something else. He didn't say it outright, just stood there, looking at me with that broken face. He knew I'd taken the coat, Lemoine's coat. Maybe he thought I'd killed him. Maybe he hoped I had. But you didn't. No. Then who did? Fabre looked at the floor. Maigret leaned forward. Is Lemoine still alive? Fabre didn't answer. His fingers tightened around his knees. I don't know, he whispered finally. But I hope not. Finally. But I hope not. Finally. But I.
There it was. Not a confession, but something heavier. You wore his coat, Maigret said. You let his name surface again. I wanted him to be found, Fabre said. Even if I couldn't do it. Even if he'd already slipped away. The coat was a signal to whoever remembered. And someone did. Fabre met his gaze. You. Later that evening, Maigret returned to the quay and sat alone in his office. The city outside was busy with early spring. People brushing off winter coats, lovers walking close under shared umbrellas. He stared at the case files on his desk, then pushed them aside. There would be no arrest, no trial. Fabre hadn't killed the man in the canal, and Lemoine, if alive, was too far removed. His crimes lost in the bureaucratic fog of 2 decades and multiple jurisdictions. The most that remained was a coat, a name, and a memory written in invisible ink. Still, there was one final thing to do. The next morning, Maigret returned to the boarding house where Fabre had once stayed. Room 12 now emptied of its former occupant. He handed the concierge a sealed envelope. If he comes back, give him this. She looked skeptical but nodded. The letter inside was short. You were not the ghost. She was. And she forgave you before you even knew you'd failed her. Maigret walked back through the morning fog toward the scene, pipe in hand. Rain had started again, soft and steady. He didn't mind. Paris moved on, as it always did, past old names and newer ones, past the mutter of street markets and the clatter of early spring umbrellas. Maigret returned to his desk at the Quai des Orfèvres, where papers still stacked themselves without invitation, and Lognon still brought misgivings into every conversation, like rain brought damp into the walls. I suppose this means the Venice case is closed, Lognon muttered one morning, eyeing a report on his desk as if it might bite. It was never a case, Maigret said. Lognon gave a huff. A man dies, a name resurfaces, ghosts crawl out of corners, but no crime. There was a crime, Maigret replied, not looking up from his notes. Only no one could prove it, and no one now needs to. Lognon didn't reply. He didn't understand or didn't want to. He liked lines drawn, crimes punished, ends tied like packages with court dates stamped on top. But Maigret had learned, long ago, that some stories didn't end that way. Some ended only when people stopped remembering or when they began to. Later that day he received a small envelope in his inbox. No return address. Postmarked from Geneva. Inside was a single photograph, creased and slightly faded. It showed 3 people on a pier, a man in a dark coat with a slanted smile, a younger woman with a scarf caught in the wind, and another man in profile, darker, quiet, apart. On the back, a line in an elegant hand, Riva degli Schiavoni, 1942. Then he slipped it into a drawer and closed it without a word. It was 2 days later in a corridor at the Palais de Justice that he heard the voice. He had been walking slowly, pipe unlit in one hand, coat draped over his other arm. The hallway was mostly empty, echoing faintly with the hum of low conversation from the adjoining rooms. And then, just ahead, the soft murmur of a voice familiar not by sound but by rhythm. The deliberate slowness, the low cadence, the suggestion that every word had been weighed before release. Maigret turned the corner and saw him. The man was seated on a bench, speaking with a court clerk. Nothing urgent, something about translating an old record from Italian. His back was hunched slightly, his coat too large on his frame. His hair was white now, but cut cleanly. The mustache was gone. Only the eyes remained the same, unreadable, tired, defiant. Lemoine. Maigret didn't speak. He watched as the man stood, thanked the clerk, and turned to walk away, not noticing Maigret standing in shadow just beyond the arch. The footsteps were unhurried. No trace of guilt, only the soft shuffle of a man used to moving without causing ripples. Maigret followed at a distance, not to confront, just to confirm. Lemoine left the Palais and walked toward the scene. He stopped briefly at a kiosk, bought a newspaper and continued. Not once did he look behind him. Back at the quay, Maigret poured himself a glass of white wine and stood by the stove. Torrance came in quietly. "There's a letter," he said, handing over an envelope. Maigret opened it. Inside was a short note, unsigned, typed on an old Remington. "You were right. I tried to vanish, but I stayed too close to the water. Some of us never really leave Venice. I did not kill him, but I watched him drown, and I did nothing. There was no name, no address. Just this, a confession of a man who had carried a silence so long it had turned into a mirror." Maigret set the letter down. The words weren't a legal confession. No motive, no evidence, no witnesses, but they held the quiet weight of truth. The kind that never asks forgiveness, only acknowledgement. He lit his pipe. Madame Maigret greeted him at the door with a smile and a gentle tug at his coat collar. "You look as if you've spent the day underwater," she said. In a way, she didn't ask more. She knew the signs, the slow pace, the way he looked out the window too long, the barely touched plate at dinner. Later he sat with her in the living room as she knitted. The lamp cast a golden circle on the floor. Rain began again, brushing the glass softly. "Did you solve?" she asked after a time. "No," he said, "but I understood it." She looked up from her needles. "That's something," she said. He nodded. She poured him a cup of tea and resumed her knitting. Outside, the street was quiet. A taxi rolled by, its headlights washing the buildings in pale light for just a moment. And somewhere, in some forgotten part of the city, a man who once sang in Venice, sat alone, with no coat now, no mask, no music, just silence, the kind that follows you when the water finally goes still. The days began to stretch into the faint warmth of early April, but Paris remained hesitant, its skies a steady blur of grey. On Boulevard Saint-Germain, the cafes had opened their terraces more out of custom than optimism. Rain came and went like a second thought. Maigret stood under the awning of a newspaper kiosk, not reading the headlines, just watching the slow flow of the crowd. His pipe remained unlit in his coat pocket. The morning was too damp for smoke, or perhaps he simply wasn't in the mood for it. A man brushed past him, trench coat flapping slightly in the wind, umbrella folded and dripping. He resembled Fabre, in posture, in stride, and Maigret's eyes followed him instinctively. But it wasn't him, just another figure passing through. He hadn't seen Fabre since that quiet meeting in room 12. The envelope Maigret had left with the concierge had vanished the next morning. The room was cleared out. No forwarding address, no sign of the coat, nothing. No one had claimed the body from the canal either. Lepic's cousin had come once, stood in front of the file photo of the drowned man, and left without a word. A few hours later, A municipal cremation was scheduled. A man with no enemies. A man who saw too much. A man who called someone ghost and was perhaps right on both counts. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret sat at his desk, while the city flickered through the windows like a film reel winding without urgency. He sipped a weak coffee Torrance had left on the corner of his blotter, already going cold. Inspector Lognon passed by the door, casting a look inside as if considering whether to step in, then thought better of it. It had been that kind of week, the kind where everything felt both resolved and unsettled. There was no arrest to file, no conclusion to type, no villain to parade, only a cluster of soft truths, like sediment at the bottom of a glass. Maigret opened the drawer and took out the photograph again, the one from Geneva. The woman in the scarf had her eyes half closed, caught mid-laugh, the man beside her turning to say something, and the third figure, Fabre, he was sure of it now, stood a step behind them, hands in his coat pockets, as if already preparing to leave. It had the feel of a moment that no longer existed. Not to the crime scene but a quiet stretch farther west, where the water moved slower and ducks skimmed across the surface in bored circles. There was a bench under a plane tree, still slick with the morning's rain. He sat anyway. The street violinists didn't come this far, nor did tourists. Just children with their nannies and old men walking with canes that barely touched the ground. He thought of Venice, of Veronique, who had perhaps slipped into the water without resistance, or perhaps vanished into another life, of Le Morne whose crimes were like stains set too deep into the cloth to be lifted, no matter how long you soaked them, and of Fabre, or André, or whatever his name truly had been, a man who had sung once, who had stood at the edge of another person's suffering and failed to act, who had then carried that silence forward, year after year, wearing it like a second skin. Was that justice? Was it punishment? Maigret didn't know, but he understood. That was enough. Rain tapped against the windows like someone hesitant to interrupt. Torrance had left. Lognon too. Only the old night clerk remained, asleep behind the desk, with a pencil still in his hand. On Maigret's desk sat a square envelope, heavy paper, no markings. He opened it carefully. Inside a single sheet. Inspector, you asked me why I wore the coat. It was not disguise. It was remembrance. It was not guilt, either, not in the way one might expect. It was a kind of mourning, for the man I could have been, for her, for the silence I let grow too wide to cross. I have left Paris, not to escape, only to stop watching doorways. There is a song I never finished. I hum it sometimes. It ends the same way it begins, in silence. You were kind to listen. That was more than most ever did. Maigret folded the letter once, then placed it into the drawer with the others. The photograph, the matchbook, the report that listed the cause of death, but not the reason for it. That night, at home, Madame Maigret served veal with small white onions and potatoes cooked in duck fat. He ate slowly, thoughtfully, as the rain whispered outside their window. She didn't ask about the case. She never did unless he brought it up, but tonight he did. There was a man who sang, he said, not looking up from his plate, and a woman who listened, and someone else, who thought he could make them both disappear. She poured him more wine. Did he succeed? No, Maigret said, not entirely. She smiled faintly. The quiet ones rarely do. Later, after she had gone to bed, he stood at the open window and looked out over the rooftops. The sky was colorless, neither fully night nor truly gray. Somewhere, a piano played faintly from a third-floor window, a waltz, losing its rhythm, at the edges. He filled his pipe but didn't light it. Instead, he listened to the rain. No words, no song, just the quiet end of something that had taken too long to finish. Spring arrived in Paris, not with celebration but with small changes. Windows left open, a little longer, cafe chairs returning to the sidewalks, a lemon tree reappearing on a balcony across from Maigret's flat. There were no declarations, only suggestions. The scent of bread rising earlier in the morning, the river looking less like steel and more like pewter. Maigret sat in his office with his jacket off, and sleeves rolled up. It was a slow afternoon, the kind where the phones rang only out of habit, and no one remembered what they were meant to say once they picked up. In front of him was a small folder marked closed, no further action. Inside, the body in the canal, the photograph from Geneva, the letter without a signature, a case, and not a case, a story, and not quite a story. He picked up the photograph again, the one from Venice.
1942. He looked at Veronique's smile, caught between shadow and sun. The man beside her, perhaps Lemoine, perhaps someone else, was whispering something into her ear. And Fabre, then young, stiff, uncomfortable, stood apart, as if sensing already he did not belong to the picture. What would she have become, had she lived, or had she vanished? Maigret would never know, and he was no longer certain it mattered. Some mysteries were meant to remain unfinished, not out of failure, but because their truth was buried in the kind of silence that did not accuse, but simply endured. That evening, he took a walk along the Canal Saint-Martin. The water was calm, touched by light in soft silver shards. The trees above had started to bud. Their green was pale, tentative. He stopped near the locks where the violinist had been found. There was no trace now, no police tape, no memory etched into the stone. Just two ducks paddling in the shadow of a barge, a man reading a newspaper on the far bench, a dog asleep on a bit of sun-warmed concrete. Still, Maigret lingered. Sometimes a place remembered things better than people did. He thought of Fabre, where he might be now, not far perhaps, somewhere near the sea, he imagined, maybe a small town, with a name no one bothered to pronounce correctly, singing in the evenings, when no one was listening, or not singing at all. The letter had made no promises, no apologies either, just an acknowledgement of weight, the kind of quiet that pressed into a life, changed its shape, but left no visible marks. Back at home, Madame Maigret was placing fresh daffodils in a vase, near the window. The breeze stirred them gently. They smelled faintly of citrus. And, "You were out walking," she said without turning. "Yes." "The canal." "Yes." She gave a small nod and resumed arranging the stems. After dinner, roast chicken, green beans and a wine he didn't recognize. They sat together in the living room. The radio murmured softly, some program about old chansons, voices recorded decades ago, and now sounding like ghosts caught in static. He lit his pipe. This time, he let it burn. She looked at him over her knitting. "It's finished now, isn't it?" "Yes." And there was no one to arrest, no one to blame. She gave a quiet and adjusted the yarn in her lap, but Maigret added, "Someone still carried the guilt. That's often worse." Yes. He didn't need to say more. She didn't need to ask. In the days that followed, Maigret returned to his usual cases: petty theft, a hotelier with 2 ledgers, and a nervous twitch, a brawl that turned into something worse in a Belleville cafe. The city, untroubled by Fabre's sadness, or Veronique's vanishing, went on cataloguing its small injustices, but every now and then, he'd find himself near the canal again. One morning, while standing near the spot where the body had been found, a child approached him. She was perhaps 7 or 8, with a torn red ribbon in her hair, and the deliberate shyness of someone instructed not to speak to strangers, but willing to make exceptions. "You're the policeman," she said. Maigret looked down, surprised. "Who told you that?" "My uncle. He said you found a ghost here." He smiled. "No," he said gently. "The ghost found me." She considered this, nodded with surprising seriousness, and ran off. He watched her go, then walked back toward the quay, the morning sun pressing through the clouds in faint gold streaks. That evening, as he was closing up for the night, Torrance entered with a thin envelope, postmarked again from Geneva. He said, "No return address." Maigret opened it. A postcard this time. The photograph was of a faded seashore. On the back, in the same typewritten font, "The tide recedes, but the sand remains." She sang once, quietly, "When I thought she was asleep. I didn't deserve it. I remember it still." Maigret slipped the card into the folder with the rest, then stood, stretched, and turned out the light. There was nothing more to solve, but there was still something to carry. There was still something to carry. There was still something.